Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about reforms in the Gilded Age, and we're going to be kind of setting the stage for later eras of change in American history, specifically the Progressive Era. So during this time period, there was actually a surge in religious belief, similar to the earlier revivals that we've talked about in this class. So we've talked about the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. There was a third religious revival that was happening during the Gilded Age, which is represented by like huge outpourings of religious faith like we see at one of these sermons from D.L. Moody. And this religious revival that was happening during this time period was the product of a few major changes that we want to highlight. First of all, like obviously the way that people lived during this time period was changing as people were moving from the countryside to cities. Cities were becoming overcrowded, and obviously there was large amounts of poverty. There was also floods of immigrants that were coming into these areas like New York and Boston and Chicago. There was big business that was taking over during this time period. A lot of people were dismayed by the corruption of big business and the growth of monopolies, and they worried about the morality of America during that time period and what capitalism was doing to the United States. There was also concerns about America becoming too materialistic. As consumerism grew, and as we had like opportunities to buy new products, there was a fear that we were, basically caring more about material goods than, say, spiritual ones. And then, of course, there was the threat of Darwin's theory of evolution and how to reconcile the beliefs of religion with this increasingly popular idea of Darwin's theory of natural selection and evolution. So really, this kind of takes the form of a new religious movement, which is best probably defined by the social gospel. So the social gospel is the most important part of the religious revival that's happening during this time period. And the social gospel basically was the idea of taking Protestant beliefs, religious beliefs, and applying them to fix the problems of society. So it was using religion to, say, help those who were in need because of poor living conditions, to help those who were facing like alcoholism, to try to reduce the crime in cities and so forth. Okay, and this was led by Protestant ministers at the time like Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden. So the social gospel is going to become an incredibly important religious movement, and it's going to inspire a lot of changes in American society. Perhaps the first one that we need to know is its effect to just religious denominations during this time period. So we start to see the beginnings of new religious beliefs coming into America. The Salvation Army, for the example, comes from England for the first time in 1880, and it's still around today. And you probably have seen them on street corners, obviously, asking for donations. They reflect the social gospel because they're trying to help the poor, help the needy. There's also like changes in like the growth of certain denominations within American society, specifically the Catholic Church. As new immigrants come to America, they bring their religion. Many of the immigrants that are coming are Catholic, and so we see the growth of the Catholic Church during this time period. It never becomes the dominant religion. Protestantism is still probably what a majority of Americans' faith would be categorized under, but the Catholic Church is now more powerful than it has been in previous times. Okay, we also see the beginning of other organizations during this time period that have religious affiliations. So the YMCA and the YWCA are good examples of this. The YMCA stands for Young Men's Christian Association. And even though it was formed before the Civil War, during this time period, it becomes really, really popular. And the whole idea behind the YMCA is to provide young people with maybe morally positive places to go in urban areas. And so like people are attracted to gyms, to play volleyball or to exercise or to play basketball, which was invented in 1891 at a YMCA. And so this organization becomes an important part of American culture as well and reflects the social gospel movement. Okay, probably the most important change that's happening during this time period, though, is the growth of reform movements. And so that's what we're going to kind of focus on for most of this lecture. Now, I want to start with the settlement movement, which is probably one of the earliest and most important. So the settlement house movement was the idea of establishing houses within the United States that would provide like help for immigrants and for the poor who are coming into urban areas. Now, one of the earliest settlement houses was Hull House, which was established in 1889 by an early advocate for the settlement house movement, Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams becomes a leading figure in the settlement house movement, and what she does is she provides a place to, not only provide education for immigrant children, but also to provide job training and even like a social environment for kids that's positive, as opposed to like some of the impoverished conditions that they were experiencing on the streets of cities. Now, the settlement house movement is important because it gave rise to other movements as well. Women became very politically active in these settlement houses. So you've got women like Florence Kelley, who actually worked in Hull House for a time. And then what she does is she lobbies through Hull House to try to fix other problems in American society. So like her big issue she was worried about was conditions in sweatshops. And so she became a strong opponent of not only sweatshops, but also child labor in the United States. She successfully lobbied the state of Illinois to ban child labor in 1893. And then later on, she would help pass the Keating-Owen child labor law in 1916, which would ban products that were made with child labor across state lines. Now, another important reform movement that was tied to women and to improving morality was the Temperance Movement. Now, the Temperance Movement wasn't new during this time period. It had existed in the earlier antebellum period, but there was growing concern after the Civil War. There was a growth of saloons not only out west, but in obviously these urban cities that were developing across the country. And there was a fear that obviously these saloons were places where gambling was taking place, there was immorality, there was drunkenness, and so this was obviously hurting American society. And so there was a rebirth of temperance organizations that were trying to stop the consumption of alcohol. Probably the most important during this time period was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was established in 1874. It was primarily a women's organization, and it was led by the woman who's pictured here, Frances Willard. And they became an important force in helping to try to ban alcohol in first state by state, but then eventually pushing for the 18th Amendment, which would get passed by 1919. Another important figure that's associated with the temperance movement, who's probably really famous just because of her kind of over-the-top antics, and that was Carrie Nation. Now, Carrie Nation lost a husband to alcoholism, and so she became a diehard advocate against alcohol. And so what she would do was she would go into saloons, she would go into bars, and she would carry a hatchet, and she would use that hatchet to break up barrels of alcohol or break bottles of whiskey or other types of hard alcohol. And so she became a militant crusader against alcohol. But her actions, for better or for worse, also helped gain awareness for this cause. Now, kind of as I've been talking about, a lot of these reform movements are connected to women's rights. And so we kind of need to acknowledge that the women's rights movement that began in the antebellum period with Seneca Falls in 1848 was still ongoing during this time period as well. And so, obviously, in 1848, there was a push for women to get the right to vote. And women like Susan B. Anthony, who was at Seneca Falls, had been basically pushing for women to be included in important amendments like the 15th Amendment. When the 15th Amendment didn't include women, obviously there was a push for women to pass an amendment of their own. And so Susan B. Anthony kind of led for an additional push after the Civil War was over for more women's rights. And she helped found an organization that became known as NAWSA, which stands for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And while it was founded by Susan B. Anthony, it was also led by another upcoming leader in women's rights by the name of Carrie Chapman Catt. And what Chapman Catt did that was really important was she tied kind of the traditional role of women in society to the importance of voting. So women had traditionally been the protectors of morality. We see that all the way back to the Republican motherhood. And what she argued is like, if women are going to be the protectors of morality in American society, then they absolutely must have the right to vote, because women should have a say over these public issues that are affecting cities, especially issues like education. And so she's tying kind of the traditional views of women to this right that is becoming so important to women across the country. Now, women are going to see gains in terms of suffrage during this time period. Starting out west, we know that women had more freedom out west, like we've seen that in earlier lectures, and so it makes sense that women got the right to vote out west first. And the first state to actually give women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1869. Well, there's a number of other states that are going to give women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment ever comes in. And what this is doing is this is building momentum for a national amendment, which will get passed by 1920, and that's the 19th Amendment. Now, the last issue that we need to talk about is education. And education was tied to morality as well. During this time period, there was fear that kids were running around on the streets, they were getting involved in gangs. That was morally corrupting them. And so the idea is that we need to get kids in school full time. And so there was this push for compulsory attendance laws. And so what they begin to do is they start to require education. And kids have to be in school for a certain number of years. We see this in like places like the Northeast, New York in 1874, Illinois by 1883. And there's other changes to education as well. Some of the important kind of advances that are made in terms of education include, we see an increase in high schools. So by 1900, there's 6,000 high schools across the country. The introduction of the first kindergartens, the growth of Catholic parochial schools as more and more Catholic immigrants come into the United States. The land grant colleges, which lead to the establishment of public universities like the University of Illinois. And then electives within those colleges all kind of create changes within education. Now, this is all important because it's going to lead to a movement that we're going to talk about in period 7, and that is the progressive era, which is when these individual reformers are going to take their message and start to push government to take on these challenges and actually start to pass laws that will fix some of the problems that they see happening during the Gilded Age. Take care.